Hello and welcome to the session. In the previous sessions, we have seen the definition and the thought process behind the single responsibility principle. In this session, we will look at a slightly different flavor of the definition. The principle that we studied so far states that every software component should have one and only one responsibility. In place of the term responsibility, we are going to put a new phrase, reason to change. So now it reads, every software component should have one and only one reason to change. These are the words that Robert Uncle Bob Martin uses in his book to define single responsibility principle. So what's this new phrase, reason to change? In the words of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, the only thing that is constant is change. In other words, change is inevitable. This quote applies to the software world as well. Software is never dormant. It always keeps changing. Let me explain this with an example. We'll start with the same student class that we used for our previous session, the original version of it. Assume that this student class is part of a software module which is already in production. There could be multiple reasons for a software component to change in future. Let's do a small exercise. Let's try to jot down a few reasons to change for the student class that could possibly come up in the near future. A change in the student ID format as suggested by the school management. This is one possibility. A change in the student name format as necessitated by a state law. Another possibility. A change in the database backend as advised by the technical team. Another one. Okay, we have come up with 3 now. Maybe we can come up with more, but we have to stop at some point. So we have 3 reasons to change. What does the single responsibility principle say? The new definition. Every software component should have one and only one reason to change. Why? What's the problem if our class has more reasons to change? If a software component has multiple reasons to change, then the frequency of changes to it will increase. Every change to a software component opens up the possibility of introducing bugs into the software. So if there are frequent changes to a software component, the probability of introducing a bug goes up. This would require more time and effort to be spent on retesting the software after the changes are made, because we need to make sure we catch all the bugs before we release the modified version of the software. More time and effort means more money. Like they say, it's all about money, honey. So the difference between following and not following the single responsibility principle could be a considerable financial impact. And this applies not just to the single responsibility principle, but to all other solid principles as well. So you should understand that the solid principles are not just some fancy good to have things for your software. These are important design principles which can translate to considerable software maintenance costs in the long run. So back to our code snippet. How do we fix this? What can we do about the multiple reasons to change? We'll repeat the same move we did in our last session. we'll take the database operations out and move it to a separate repository class. Here we go. Because we split the classes, let's split the reasons to change as well. So the student class is left with 2 reasons to change, and the repository class has 1 reason to change. 2 is still a problem, isn't it? We are supposed to have only 1 reason to change, right? Technically, yes. But if the reasons are closely related to one another, you can go ahead and combine them. So if we examine the 2 reasons to change for the student class closely, one is related to student ID and another is related to student name. We could combine both these and say changes to student profile. So now both our classes follow the new definition of the single responsibility principle, which says every software component should have 1 and only 1 reason to change. So this new definition, which replaces responsibility with reason to change, is just a new perspective. At the end of the day, the action which we took to fix is the same in the previous session and the current session. So these 2 definitions are pretty much the same. You can pick whichever you like. So that brings us to the end of this session. We started with a slightly modified definition of the single responsibility principle, but then we saw how both the definitions point in the same direction at the end of the day. That's all for this session. Let's move on to the next one now.